Welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Did you ever wonder, after the collapse of human and Earth systems, what kind of organizations are we going to have in the human sphere? Let's have that conversation with Richard Bartlett. All right. Richard Bartlett, it's really great to have you here on the podcast, The Poetry of Predicament. I'm Dean Walker, and this is, I think it's the 5th of December in 2018, and I've just recently stumbled into your writing, and may I call you Rich?
Sure.
Okay. I stumbled into your writing mostly on Medium. I'm on there a lot, and then followed some of the threads that you imply in those articles, and it's just been a joy. We've just had a chance to talk for a few minutes before we've gotten going here, and I hope I did an okay job in both introducing myself and kind of giving you a sense of what seemed to me like quite a bit of overlap of some of the adventures that you've had in, growing up and then into adulthood and so on, and some overlay that seems similar to me as well. And I also recently watched I think it was an hour or so video that was great with you and another person, again, I believe through Medium. And what I'd love to do is ask us both. Certainly I've already taken my time, so if I could ask you to give us as brief a version of, what are the salient points in chronology that has you end up being the person that you are. And I'm particularly interested for the audience that I believe this goes out to have us talk about, what are the challenges of being a human being now, and at a time when it seems to me that we are facing predicaments, things that don't provide room for solutions, or at least not obvious ones. And so there's this immense opportunity for a different way of relating, a different way of being, and a different way of creating that I don't think would be here if we weren't in such trouble. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk with you, because your writing is so exciting, and you've been doing some projects recently, some travel and some leading, facilitating some events. So I'd be very curious if you would tour us through how that lives for you, how these times live for you, and what they call you to do and who they call you to be. So welcome here.
Thank you. You said, in the briefest way, introduce myself. It's really difficult. That question is already take me a few hours to answer it properly. And that's that's not a joke. It's like all of the context and the relationships seem to be a really important part of the story, and slicing them off is like a kind of a violence or like an invitation to misunderstanding or missing some of the important parts.
Could I just stop you there, because I appreciate what you're saying, and I'd like to take some of that pressure off. I meant what I said, because I kind of think I was coming from, well, we've just got this less than an hour now, and hope we can get, to the really good stuff, whatever that is. And I don't know what I'm talking about. I would love to hear your.
Sure. We've got time. I'm not in a big hurry.
So as long as, perhaps if we hit a limit and there seems like there's enough for some other conversation, if we can set up another round,
cool.
Relax, and off we go.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so some points of chronology. you can see that I'm white. My grandparents are European, all around the Netherlands and England and Scotland. But you can hear in my accent that I'm from the South Pacific. I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that's a really important ingredient, you know, like that's a really important part of my story, that I'm not just white, I'm not just European, I'm also Pākehā, which is like the other half of this bicultural society that we live in, the original half being indigenous. And the relationship in Aotearoa, New Zealand, between Pākehā and indigenous people obviously is rife with violence and harm, like all the other colonized places. But if you could somehow compare all these awful experiences next to each other in a global scale, you'd see that the colonization in New Zealand was not as evil as it was in other places. And so there's more remnants of indigenous culture thriving here than there are in most places. And I think I've benefited a lot from that. And it's a very important ingredient in my way of being in the world. So that's one chronology. The other one is my immediate family were really quite a peculiar kind of Christian, you know, like a really, it's quite, maybe it's familiar to you in the US. Over here, it's quite rare. This sort of 1950s style, quite fundamentalist, you know, like only men speaking in church. All the songs we sing are like 400 years old. Very, you know, the young Earth was only created like what 6,000 years ago. That kind of church. I was raised in one of those, and in a rural area, so my view of the world was very constrained from a young age, because that was kind of like the only inputs I had really were like, this is life, this is the cosmos, this is right and wrong, here are the answers for you. And it really took me a lot, you know, as a late bloomer to get over that. I think I stopped going to church when I was about 19 or 20, and got excommunicated, which is now I wear as a badge of honor. And I say that with, you know, with great love and respect for my parents and for that community too. But they recognized that we had insurmountable differences, and they removed me from the community, which I totally approve. So that's an important part too, you know, like to be raised in this very, I don't even know what the words are for it. This kind of linear, there's one way, there's one rightness, there's one truth, this ultimate truth reality. And then to kind of rupture out of that towards the end of my adolescence and step into, I feel like that was almost like a pre-modern understanding that I was raised with. And then I stepped out and went to university and did engineering. And so then I'm in the modern world, you know, like science, engineering, determinism, this sort of stuff. And very quickly went from modern to postmodern, and, you know, started reading from much more diverse sources and getting involved with some activism and stuff like this. And then suddenly I'm in this, like, yeah, everything is relative. The best we can do is sit in a circle and make consensus. Or perhaps we can be guided by some sense of aesthetic or quality or beauty, this creative force that drives us, like this really murky territory, you know. It's kind of like my little personal journey spanned thousands of years of human development in the space of about a decade, I guess. The most probably obvious marker in my recent history is Occupy Wall Street, 2011. I saw it happening in Wall Street from here in New Zealand, watching on Facebook, you know, just seeing these weird images of like what looked like Gestapo style towers, surveillance towers with the NYPD, really in such contrast to these like quite hippie looking people sitting in circles, having conversations that were meaningful to them, playing drums. And then you have this like surveillance thing right there, like really, really peculiar photographs like that coming through. And then I saw 600 and something people got arrested on Brooklyn Bridge. And while I was watching that happen on the live stream on Facebook, it was just not mentioned on any of the mainstream media outlets that I was familiar with. And that, again, that contrast between those, what looked like people having a happy, thriving, peaceful development kind of a space, and then this weird, harsh smash from the state, and this invisibility of the media. That kind of clash between all those things just motivated me. It said, like, there must be something here. Like, what's going on? This is really discordant. And so then, you know, like kind of a month after Occupy Wall Street started, there was a global day of action, and some people in Wellington, where I live, said we're going to do an Occupy something in the Civic Square here. So I got involved with that, and within a few hours, I guess my whole life had turned around. Like, it was just the first time that I'd been in the city square, meeting with citizens who wanted to talk about whatever was important to talk about as a citizen, unmediated, you know, like, just, here I am, I'm a person, I'm terrified or angry or excited or inspired or whatever. Like, I've got these experiences that are happening, and I want to talk to my other citizens about it and see what they think. And that was so stark that I hadn't seen that before. And of course, the method was really compelling as well, that we were doing this in a, what we say self-organizing, maybe not the best word, but that there was this kind of distributed approach where all of these different activities are happening around the world all at once without any central coordination body. And then at the small scale, things were happening in consensus circles. So people really putting the effort in to learn from each other, grow shared understanding, listen to dissent as a source of wisdom to improve the quality of the proposal that someone's put. Both of those methods, both the kind of distributed swarming self-organizing thing and the local consensus thing, both of those were really profound components to me that said, oh, well, yes, we may be driving our civilization off the cliff, as in we need to mobilize extraordinary resources of creativity to repair our relationship with each other and with the rest of the natural world. Like, yes, there's a big job, but if we use these methods of swarming when swarming's right and consensus when consensus right, we can unlock this collective intelligence. We can unlock this extraordinary empathy and creativity, and really suddenly system change felt to me like, oh, okay, this could happen very rapidly. You know, like our Occupy camp was growing about 20% per day, and many of the other camps around the world were growing at about a similar rate. And it doesn't take very long, you know, to keep that going. It doesn't take very long before you've got everyone, you know. So I had this, there was a few weeks there, I was like, oh, right, okay, we're nearly done. Get rid of the economic system. We'll have this whole new bottom-up kind of world governance thing. And I was, supercharged of enthusiasm and optimism. Obviously, it didn't quite work out that way. We discovered the severe limitations of trying to organize a village with no doors and no, not many resources. And as Occupy Wellington kind of disintegrated, I was really, like, unbelievably lucky in retrospect that I got to transition my focal point from this swarming community and Occupy over just literally like 3 blocks down the road to this space called Inspiral, which, 7 years later, I still don't know how to explain it very, very clearly, but it's a network of people who are trying to make the world better. They do a lot of, they seem to build social enterprises, so businesses that are doing good in the world, that prioritize positive social impact ahead of profit. And they do it through a lot of peer-to-peer support and horizontal, decentralized self-management kind of, experimenting with different forms and trying to do something good in the world. So like a really, a cousin of Occupy. So I could just transition my energy from there to there. And at Inspiral, this little crew of us from Occupy said, hey, we're having this mind-blowing time with consensus decision making and with decentralized self-managing swarms. Wouldn't it be great if we had some software to support more people to have that experience? And can you build it for us? That was kind of what we put to the crew at Inspiral, because they have a lot of tech savvy people. And they said, yeah, that's a cool idea, absolutely, but we're not going to build it for you. Like, this is a DIY network. Like, you will build it and we'll support you to. And so that's the birth story of Lumio, which we kind of crystallized into a worker-owned cooperative, building this very simple piece of software, which is like a discussion forum with facilitation tools. So within your school or your co-op or your small company or your board of directors, you can have your discussion online and then raise a proposal and see what the other members think. And so you can do consensus, or it's not like a strict consensus tool, but it's like a collaborative decision-making tool. It's like, if you want to make decisions that involve the voices of multiple people and facilitate that to some kind of agreement, then Lumia is the tool for that. So that was, we started that in 2012. And I have some, like I mentioned, I've got this kind of engineering background, so it was sort of natural to build a software startup. But I noticed over the course of years of being a co-founder on the startup that my interest moved kind of away from the software and towards the team. Like, how do we stay in harmony? Like, we've got these different people. They're very creative. They're very intelligent. They're very autonomous. You know, these are all people that have some pretty radical values about autonomy. Like, how do we keep these in harmony? Like, that they're all doing different things, but those different things add up to something greater than the sum of the parts, and that's coherent. That's going in one direction. Yeah, I just got more and more of like the team mum maybe, or something, you know, like how do we get everyone feeling good? And then once people are feeling good, probably good work will emerge. That was sort of my maybe immature hypothesis. And then in the last 2 years, this is kind of the next chapter. The last 2 years, I really made that transition more explicit and started another company, which is like a total sibling or cousin of Lumio, called The Hum. And it's a cousin because it's the same people, but doing slightly different stuff. And that's a consulting, training, hosting, facilitating consultancy. And that consultancy is kind of just an excuse for me to go and visit all of the interesting groups that are trying to work in a different way, in a non-hierarchical or a decentralized or a bottom-up way, and discover what's hard, like what are they struggling with, and then what about our experiences, because I've had great experiences of working in this way. What about those positive experiences can translate into their context? Like, are there some lessons here from my very unique context that can translate out into other people? So that's been the project for the last 2 years, which has been super, super satisfying. We're discovering that we have got something to offer, that there are some really common ways that a lot of these collaborative groups tend to fail, or at least to struggle, and that we're showing that sometimes it's possible to intervene with just the right answer at just the right time to make it less likely they're going to fail. So that's really satisfying, you know, that when it's like a climate action group or some new social enterprise or a grocery co-op, or, you know, like people that are trying to do something positive in the world in a positive way, to be able to support them to keep going and get through their struggle, and so their conflict is generative and healthy and not terminal. That's a really satisfying job. And at the same time, there's this whole other track going on, which is about what's the relationship between the small scale group experience where you have 20 people or 200 people trying to get coordinated and treat each other well and be productive, what's the relationship between that set of challenges and the larger scale, where you have 200 million or 8 billion people that are trying to get on and, you know, manage our resources and be friendly and productive and stuff. So I'm also quite actively, I don't know what I am, like a contemporary historian, like trying to discover some kind of meaningful story about what the world is doing in this moment, and or at least what humans are doing, or at least the humans that mostly speak English, or, you know, some set of all the humans that I'm connecting with, trying to find some sense in there, because there's a lot of information and not a lot of sense about what's happening in the world. So I'm trying to fill that gap.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that nicely filled in set of details. I'm curious if you have just the next kind of direction that you'd like to go, whatever the next flow direction is for the conversation, if you already have that ready. In case you don't, one thing you just mentioned caught my ear, because you jumped from the scale of working with your own people in your own organization, expanding that out to you're bringing that facilitation and that consultancy to other small groups and so on. And I get that. And you then jumped to as big a scale as one can possibly imagine in terms of humanity on the planet. And my sense is that there are probably a few levels in between, and that's where I tend to aim my efforts, is very much on the level of people who may or may not actually even have an organization. Most of my audience tends to be either alone, or they have a very small number of sympathetic kindred spirits with whom they can communicate. And it's rare that they've taken it to the level of collaborating. Mostly it's just at the level of a very small support group type situation in a very private life, and often a very lonely situation in terms of their orientation is to be collapse aware in a willfully ignorant culture. So I'm wondering if you would like to address anything about those kind of middle layers, let's just say at the level of town council that wants to do something in a new way, or and actually, you know, a corporation of some size, or I don't know what the right thing is.
Yeah.
That was just a curiosity that came through when you were saying that. But again, I'd ask that if you had a direction that you wanted to go, that you were already with, then please do that.
Cool. I think there are important steps, like defined steps of scale. And my latest article starts to give some names to these steps, and it's a very incomplete list, but the idea that there's me and my relationship between the different parts of me, and then there's the dyad, the relationship of two people, which I prefer to structure those relationships as partnerships, you know, so that we're coming to each other as equals. And then a slightly larger scale, which I named the crew, which is as big as a dinner table. So it's kind of like how many people you can get into one conversation. And then maybe there's some intermediate steps, and then I named the congregation, which is up towards, you know, up to kind of 200 people, up to Dunbar's number. And then there's more and more steps beyond that, and that until you get to 8 billion. And all of the steps seem to be important to me, you know, like in the simple terms, the relationship between the very large and the very small is important. So the example that I usually give is like, if my big issue is about sexism, and I want to live in a world free of patriarchy, I can do all of this campaigning and organizing and petitioning and mobilizing about sexism. But if I'm not interrogating my own behavior and checking, like, are my relationships stepping out of patriarchal patterns? Am I, like, aware of how I've been contaminated by this way of thinking and way of doing? And am I in the process of uncontaminating? Like, if I'm not doing that as well as the large scale, then it's like my small scale action is undermining my large scale. So it's like, at best, it achieves nothing, and probably it's doing harm. So that's kind of obvious that we need this interaction of scales. But then there's the intermediate one. So, like, there's a lot of interest right now and excitement about how new possibilities enabled by decentralized technology could somehow hold some solutions. So we've got, there's this new blockchain thing, which is, it's like a database which all of our previous digital technology is used, but instead of these existing databases, it's decentralized. So nobody owns it. It's this, like, everyone holds a piece of it and nobody's in charge. Surely that artifact is going to be something, surely we can do something useful with that, this new property. And so people get excited about a new economic system, a new voting system, like there's all these ideas about how this could unlock some of the difficult challenges that we face in cities and countries. And my answer is, if you want to build a great system, I think you need experience in a good system. Like I don't think you can jump the full gap, like as an individual autonomous person with your own strengths and discrepancies of character. I don't think on your own you can design a really great system that's gonna serve the needs of millions of people. But if you have a team of 8 people and you actually start to encounter in your lived experience what's involved in coordinating, like what is the work of getting people aligned and thriving and productive and peaceful, like what is the work at the scale of 8 people, what needs to be done to make that work? And I think that this is my intuition, that learning how to operate at that scale will unlock a whole list of insights about what your large scale system needs. And my experience has been in the last few years traveling around that there's a lot of people that are motivated by large scale change that don't have much experience at the small scale. Like you say, that they're either isolated, or they participate in these group activities, but they're always temporary groups. They're always like, it's a weekend retreat or a annual festival or this amazing conference that lasts for 3 days, and then that's, and it's dissipated. But most people don't have that much experience in a group that is 8 people or a group that's 200 people that has an ongoing sustained commitment to each other. And to me, it's that ongoing sustained commitment that unlocks all the insights and the personal development. Like you start to see, this is who I am, and this is the effect of a person like me. And maybe some of the problems that I'm motivated to solve out in the world are actually problems in me. And I only discover that kind of deep introspective wisdom from being in a intimate, committed, sustained, recurring circle that I keep coming back to.
Man, I feel like I could just we could spend a day talking about this right here, because this I just felt triggered in myself in a good way. Triggered memories of that list that I was telling you that I did, inspired by your chronology of communities of belonging, and those are some of the best times of my life. One of which was years of living with a dozen other people in a 4-story house outside of Santa Cruz, California, and it was impeccable. it was just freaking impeccable. It was beautiful. You know, we had our minor disagreements, but we had absolutely um, functional and usable methodology to bring ourselves back to relationship and clean stuff up. And it just wasn't a thing. And so I'm triggered and again, in the best way with, to have those memories out of what you're sharing. Um, and I'm curious again here, if you have another direction you want to go there. But my question in the moment is, do you see possibilities? Do you see anything in the kind of middle range that is functional, scalable, accessible for people, that would allow them to really find value and benefit, even though they're not living or working together in an ongoing way? They don't have that continuity. They have some lesser continuity. And I'd like to say that it's a bit more than the weekend workshop, but somehow significantly less than the continuity you were just talking about. Are there any models? Are there any possibilities that you've seen that yield some pretty decent results with right relationship, with creativity, possibility?
I'm really cagey and nervous around that word models, because, you know, a model is always like, it's an abstraction. It's like this attempt to recognize a pattern across different experiences and say, oh, these are the important, this is the framework, or this is the scaffolding, or these are the pillars required. And the stuff that we're talking about is so subtle that I'm not ready to recommend models, you know, like, I mean, in a really simple sense, there's a lot of buzz and hype around different kinds of agile management methodologies in organizations. And in our company, Lumio, we tried adopting agile management 3 different times. And it was, you know, basically a disaster the first 2 times. And then the 3rd time, we finally unlocked the right form that worked for us, I guess. And it's so hard to know, like, if that right form was like, yeah, the stuff it says on the website, or was just like the question or the insight that was provoked in us at that moment. And I know it's unsatisfying, you know, I know it's unsatisfying when people are looking for an answer, and I say, ooh, it depends, you know, it depends. The closest thing I have to an answer is to look not for models, but for relationships between people. So where do you see 2 people or 10 people or 100 people that are in a state of harmony, and are they open to have you join them? You know, or can they visit? Can they share with you some of their ways of being? It's so very subtle. The reason I mentioned New Zealand is I feel like we just pick up a little bit from part of that's from the indigenous culture, you know, like a lot of indigenous cultures, maybe all indigenous cultures. Te Ao Māori is a collective world, you know, it's like, it's a relational world. It starts from interdependence. That's the presumption that you start from. And if you have a whole society, a whole economy, a whole governance system that's rooted in interdependence, your models are going to be different, right? Like, so the methods of gathering and decision making and conflict resolution, all these things, they're going to be quite different from a society that starts from a position of individualism. And I'm cautious here because it's not my society, you know. Like I said, we're in a bicultural place, and I'm like looking over the fence and seeing some things and interpreting it through my own lens, and probably getting half the story back to front. But still, some of those ripples have hit me, and I'm like, I think I picked up one or two little useful ingredients there from just learning how do Indigenous people do it. Yeah, it's like I didn't learn how they did it. I learned something by watching them do it, put it that way. And when I spent a bunch of time in the US last year, my partner and I were in the US for 3 months, and most of the spaces I entered, they had none of that. They had no really, I didn't recognize any really thriving, harmonious relationships that I wanted to emulate. And so I went in there and went, look, there's too much remedial work to do here for me to, as an external visitor, to come in and go like, oh, this is how you do it. Because it's like, it requires such a long-term commitment to shift those dynamics. And it's, yeah, I'm not confident to go into into a position that has such a, I don't know, like that's lacking in some kind of interpersonal nutrients, and to say, oh, I'm going to provide all this. I can't. Like I need to be sustained with those nutrients myself. But if I was going to be in the country for a longer time, then I would be seeking out like who is it that has this interpersonal wisdom, you know, this ability to share presence and to accommodate difference and allow for people to be their unique selves without surrendering their discernment, you know, like that we can still have a clear idea about what's our focus or what's our ethics, while balancing that with an acceptance of difference. Like I'd be seeking these people out and clustering around them, you know, crystallizing off the seed of those foundational relationships. And in my short visit as an external nomad, I found them really hard to find.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate where you went with that. And it actually, your response was closer to the question that I think I should have asked. And that was, instead of some sort of model implying this is a complete structure that is replicable, and somehow if you tell me about it, I'll be able to know more about it and then try to do it and so on. So I appreciate the kind of redirect that you offered, and where I felt you redirected the conversation to is noticing elements that seem more likely than not to be present when you or I, perhaps, if we have enough similarity, we're exposed to a group of people. They're doing whatever they're doing in the way that they're doing it. And what I heard you articulating was, more often than not, here are some elements that seem to show up, that when enough of those elements are present, I want to be in that group, or I'm encouraged to work with that group because it seems like they have a momentum, they have a vibrance that they have already germinated. Is that fair to say? Is that making sense?
Yeah, like it should be fun, you know. It should be nourishing and satisfying, and that's been my standard for the last 7 or 8 years. It's like, I think, it's terrifying what's going on in the world, and still I think we can respond in a way that feels good, that's satisfying, that's sometimes like a funeral, but a lot of the times like a party.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, in some of the organizations that you've gotten to do some consulting with them, do you have some of those elements handy, in your pocket, so to speak, and to be able to say, I'm only here with you for a short while. You're asking me to come in and tell you what I see. Happy to do that. And also, you've asked me to tell you what I see in terms of what are these workable elements that seem more likely than not to show up when it is working, when it's going well. So I'm happy to share some of those. Could you say a little bit about what you share with a group when they want to
Yeah.
they want to evolve their group?
Again, it's context specific, but I do have some some slides that I'll use most places I go, put it that way.
Yeah.
And it's usually about knowing or at least imagining something about the group of people that I'm with, that most of them are, it's like we don't really go into these super traditional corporations and try and convince them to do things in a decentralized way. Like that's not really the business that we're in. We're working with people who are already trying or have already started and are struggling. And from visiting a few hundred of those, it's pretty easy to spot some patterns. And so those patterns are unique to whatever it is that that worldview or that way of thinking that people have, like whatever it is that we have in common that says to us, like, yes, I want to be working with partners as equals rather than working in a command and control hierarchy. Whatever it is that is in our personalities that makes us want to do that, it seems to come along with a few bugs in our thinking. Like there's some viruses in there. And so we'll name what some of those viruses are. So like a really common one that again, we could spend all day on is about power. And most of these groups that are seeking some equitable way of working have a shorthand for talking about power where we use the word, equality or equity or something. And the idea is we want to be in a state where everyone is equal. Everyone has more or less the same amount of influence, that no one is inflicting their influence on other people. That there's not one person that's forcing everyone else to do things they don't want to do. And that simplified idea can obscure the reality, which is I've never ever met a group where the power was distributed equally. Like it's just never happened. I've never seen it. It may happen. It probably happens in these very private corners that are not inviting me in. Fair enough. But most of the groups that I encounter, they have quite a terrain of power, and that some people have much more influence than others, and that imbalance is not always negative. This is really important, that we can do power imbalance in very healthy ways. So even just like stepping out of the work context and just into the social context, like if you come to my house, you're a guest and I'm a host, and that's a power dynamic and it's an imbalance. And if we're doing it right, it's great for both of us. Like I'm operating my host responsibility to anticipate and satisfy your needs, and you're operating with this sense of like, oh, I should respect this person. I'm on his turf. And if I'm a great host, you're going to go around and tell everyone like, wow, I went and had this wonderful time with Rich. It's like there's this balanced exchange that happens, even though we're navigating this power terrain, which is really like, I don't think it's flat. Like there's definitely a kind of some kind of hierarchy between host and guest. In the work context, in the organizing context, it's it'll come down on things more obviously like expertise. So if I'm in a software company, and I have to be honest, I'm a very, very bad software developer. I'm one of these people that just hacks things together with bits of tape and string. I'm not very good at it. It's not my expertise. But there's other people on the team that have a great deal of experience, and they're really professional and they know what they're doing. Like if there's a decision about the software engineering, I'm going to delegate to that person who I know has that expertise. And that's a really healthy imbalance, right? Like that, if we made all of our software decisions by consensus, we would be extremely slow and would come up with all of these dumb decisions. But we get to experience our human differences as a enormous resource when we're allowed to give people a mandate to act without always needing our oversight. So there's this, and everyone knows this, like everyone knows that there's a kind of imbalance that that's really healthy and happy, but it's hard to talk about when your priority is on equality and being horizontal, or whatever non-hierarchical, whatever language people use, can make it difficult to talk about the healthy kind of difference that we have. So we would name, hey, look, this is a thing that happens. There's different ways to talk about it. I really like, I thought it was Starhawk that came up with it, but then I realized she was quoting someone else and I've forgotten who that was. But she talks about, in her book, The Empowerment Manual, which is a great, great, great little book about like how to do groups, especially consensus groups. She talks about 4 different kinds of power. 2 of them, I'll just talk about 2 of them. One of them is power over and the other is power with. So power over is this coercive thing where one person inflicts their will on someone else without permission. Like that's the thing that we're trying to avoid. We're trying to get out of this domination, coercion thing. Okay, so usually that's what people have in mind when they say we're going to get together and we're going to be equal, is we're going to be non-coercive. We're not going to dominate each other. And then she talks about power with, and that's like, yeah, the reputation, the social capital, the level of influence that you have earned by demonstrating that you have commitment or expertise, or you're prioritizing this, or you've got good character, or whatever it is that you've done that other people in the group have looked at you and said, I'm going to empower you. I'm going to give you more weight in this decision because of your reputation, because of your history. And that's really, really healthy. And if you have the language to distinguish the power over from the power with, then you can say, hey, this looks like a healthy expression, or this looks like a toxic expression, and you can do something with it. But if you don't have the language to distinguish those 2 different kinds of imbalance, what usually happens is people just kind of sweep it under the rug because, hey, we're all equal. No one's got more power than anyone else. And it's like, we know that's not true, but we said it's true. And so we're stuck in this uncomfortable state. So that's a really common one. We've got a handful of different ideas like that, where it's like most of your groups are probably tripping on this. And if we can help iron out the footpath so you're less likely to trip again, then you're more likely to keep going and discover some new problems together.
So I'm curious, if you don't mind me interrupting for just a moment, I'm curious if when you're at that level in that conversation with that organization, and it's clear that they got some stuff to work out. The word that came to mind as soon as you started mentioning this dynamic is shadow, because we all got it, and it's so prevalent in the world. And again, whether we're a good-hearted organization, wanting to do our progressive best to have a fully functional organization, or we're one that's just a regular organization that is just trying to do what organizations have always done in this paradigm. Either way, if they're willing to do this kind of work, to take on kind of winnowing out these behaviors or these unconscious patterns and so on, do you have any kind of shadow wisdom to share, or process that you offer, or suggestions that you have for their further kind of research into that, so that they can more fully be aware of and be engaged in their own shadow work?
So we quite intentionally moved through very different kinds of groups that use different language. So sometimes we're with these really, you know, hardcore activists. Sometimes we're with hippies. Sometimes we're with corporates or city officials. Like all these different kinds of groups have different language, and that I think the concept that you're reaching for when you talk about shadow, other people use different language for it, and even like in some of those contexts, like in an organizational context, often if you start talking about shadow, you get painted into a corner as some kind of yeah, you know, you're like this kind of hippie spiritualist, idealist, detached from reality kind of, you know, it sort of can invite all of these associations that give people an excuse to not listen. Speaking, you know, I'm kind of just describing my own experience.
Sure.
But what has changed recently is that all of a sudden, everyone's talking about psychological safety. And that's a really great doorway. And there's an article in the New York Times which describes Google's massive research project called Project Aristotle, where they studied, I think, hundreds or maybe even thousands of their project teams across Google and tried to understand what is it that the good ones have in common. Like, what can we measure about these teams that will give us some insight about why they're performing so well. And the strongest insight they could gain from that research was that the teams who had psychological safety were the ones that did the best. And they described psychological safety as you know, everyone feels comfortable to show up as they are in that moment. They can just be who they are. They're not portraying some kind of character or playing a role. They're just being themselves. Everyone can voice their discomforts, and they can disagree and feel like they're going to be heard when they share some dissent. And they feel like they're going to be heard when they share a new idea, you know, like that everyone has permission to be creative and have ideas and so on. So there's these kind of, it's a really positive framing, I think, and quite an accessible framing, because it's kind of got a bit of, well, it's got Google. So it's like, okay, startups, innovation, like somehow we look up to them. It's also got the psychology thing, which is like scientific. But of course, if you go, what is the obstacle to our psychological safety, then you're in the domain of shadow. Like there's well, I would be much more free to express myself if it weren't for that behavior right there. I can see from this person who is laughing at me when I'm trying to share something that's important to me, or, you know, and then you go, well, why is that person laughing? And, oh, it's because of their internalized shame. And what do we do about, and then it takes about 2 minutes before you're like right in the very depths of therapy.
Yeah. Okay.
But at least yeah, it's a new way to open the door.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's great. I'm wondering if you would share just a little bit more about this last year or so, when you've been going around the world and you've been facilitating groups in various locations and so on. You know, I'm just wondering if there are any surprises that you could share, any insights that you've ended up with, any trends in your experience. You know, we could have a dozen different people follow exactly the track that you did, go to exactly the same cities, even the same organizations and so on. And you'd have 12 different, very different experiences possibly. And so I'm just curious if you would share with us any flavors of your experience with your partner and with the work you were doing and the people you met, any trends you noticed in their response to you and the work and so on?
Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot in there. One of them that I haven't talked about so much, just localized to the US, because the US was the start of the journey for me. It was I'd watched first it was Brexit and then it was Trump, in rapid succession. And in New Zealand, we're in some respects, we're like halfway between the US and the UK, like we kind of pay attention to both of those societies quite a lot. And so that was like this big slap in the face saying, hey, the 21st century has arrived and it's different. It's not what you expected. And I felt really disoriented by those two votes. And so I felt really strongly called to go to the US to try and update my sense making, like just to get on the ground and go. I mean, obviously a lot of the media that's being exported is quite disconnected from reality. So let's go on the ground and meet people and see what they think is happening. And I mean, in all honesty, part of the motivation going was I had this feeling of like what I imagine it must have been like to be in New Zealand in 1938 or something, and looking to Europe and going like, there's going to be a world war. Is that what's like, is that what's coming? I mean, I haven't lived through a world war, so I don't know what it feels like 5 years before or 10 years before. But it's sort of a guess. Like, it seems so unstable and polarized and accelerating towards disintegration. Like, I don't have anything to compare it to, so I don't know. But it's sort of, I wanted to test this theory by meeting people and going, do you feel like things are accelerating out of control, or have you got a plan? Or I wanted to see like, well, maybe there's going to be this tremendous mobilization, like there's just been this really surprising new election in the White House. Maybe this is going to provoke this whole new flourishing of activity. And what I wasn't prepared for in the US was obviously with the disclaimer of being an outsider who was there for 3 months. So, there's a lot of ignorance. There's more ignorance than wisdom there, but still maybe something will come through. Like, I wasn't prepared for the degree of trauma and shock, to the extent that most of the people I met, I didn't meet. They weren't present. They were presenting a strong face and keeping themselves protected. And I could see that was happening, but I didn't have the capacity or the commitment to shift that dynamic with most of the people that I met. So it's okay. It's understandable. We went 3 months after the election. So a lot of the kind of progressive people that we were meeting, they were genuinely in shock. So there's this shock, which is like a numbing, a shutting down of information, and a shutting down of relationship. Understandable. And then starting to get into spaces and discovering that there's not just shock, there's also this really profound grief and trauma. And it would be good if there was grief. I think grief is a way to process trauma. But mostly it was just like this really unmanaged kind of trauma. Like, so the obvious one is about slavery, that you're living in this country that has really not done much to repair the damage done by one culture enslaving another culture. And that It is so present. It's on every second piece of media, and it's in every second conversation you have. And somehow it's like the assumption is, oh, if we're talking about race, or if we're being conscious about diversity, or who's taking up speaking time, hopefully that's helping. You know, like just our awareness and our consciousness. There's this sort of assumption that that's a good thing to do. And I'm not sure that it even is. Like, I think sometimes it's like just keeping a wound open and not necessarily cleaning the wound or binding it. So there was that trauma, which was really obvious. So many different, you know, like I was in a space in California, and I was invited there to talk about my work, and someone accused me of my work not being sufficiently relevant to Black folks in the US. And I'm like, I mean, I don't know anything about the US or about what it's like to be Black there. And I'm not proposing to have done anything about that. Like, why am I receiving this onslaught? And, you know, it's like, okay, well, there's there's a context here. There's a whole bunch of historical and present damage that hasn't been resolved, right? So that it was really difficult. It was really difficult for me to maintain my sense of clarity and integrity, and just, you know, represent myself without overstepping the line, and so on. Mm-hmm. And of course, a lot of people know this. This isn't. I'm not telling you something new. That there's a great big slavery-sized trauma in the country, but I think there is something new, which is it took me months afterwards. Like, we were there for 3 months, and it took me a good few months after that to realize that in that whole journey, I didn't step into any Indigenous spaces. So it's not just that you're sitting on an unresolved slavery trauma, you're also sitting on an unresolved genocide trauma. And that doesn't even get into most conversations. Like, it's so suppressed that people don't even really know it's a thing. You know, like, even I, who have the privilege of growing up alongside a thriving Indigenous culture, didn't even kind of notice until 6 months afterwards that there was this missing piece. And so much of my understanding of, like, or my courage and my hope for a different future comes from seeing that there are other ways of being together on this land that are composed of a fundamentally different cosmology, and you're cut off from that source of wisdom and inspiration if you don't have any access to Indigenous ways of being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I somewhere in the middle of what you just said, I think you were a bit more generous than we deserve over here, and maybe I just misheard you. I'm glad that you ended up adding the genocide, the massive decimation of indigenous cultures, you know, that is at the foundation of the USA. And obviously, you know, combining that with slavery, those are some of the biggest. But I think America's got a huge list that goes way beyond its own borders for what we've done and what we continue to do and what we're doing right now. And it's interesting that we got to this place, and you mentioning these things out of a question about shadow, because you know, that's literally what I'm left with every time. I'm making a point of watching, you know, at least on a weekly basis, a round of the evening news, the broadcast news, to just see what the country's telling itself about who we are. And it's just extraordinary to me who we tell ourselves we are. And then we are somehow expecting that we're going to find something to hope for in terms of where we might go from here with that load of shit that we're carrying, it's mind-blowing. So anyway, thank you for laying out what you just laid out. Was there more that you wanted to share about that travel time and your facilitation, or was
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's an infinitely large question. I think the other component I feel I need to add, to be fair, is like this. What I just told was I kind of just reinforced a victimized narrative about the indigenous people of North America, and that's not the only story either. You know, like. On subsequent journeys, I have had the privilege of meeting more of the native people and getting just a little glimmer of people kind of showing me a crack in the door and like, look at all of this action that's happening. Like there's such an extraordinary resurgence in native identity and activism. I mean, it was really obvious at Standing Rock, obviously, but there's lots of other tendrils extending all across Turtle Island. That it's, I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful about the future. You know, that people are claiming like maybe we've been, oh, you know, what was the name of that movement? Idle no more. You know, like we have been in the background and no more. Like it's obvious that this. Settler consciousness is rotten to the core, and we're going to bring another one. And we already got it. There's this fantastic book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, by I think it's Ken. I'll have to find out the name. Neither Wolf Nor Dog, and it's a Native American elder who is basically downloading all of his wisdom into a white journalist on his deathbed, saying, at least they'll probably listen to you, you know? And he just, like, he knows what's up. Like, he knows what's wrong, and he knows what the solution is. And his granddad and great-granddad and great-great-great, most of them kind of knew what was up as well. Like, they know how to be in harmony. And it's like, it's just waiting there in this book, you know? And yeah, I'm really optimistic about what happens as the hegemony crumbles, like what new opportunities open out of that.
Yeah. Rich, I'm feeling just energetically, I'm feeling the envelope of our time together, this particular time, starting to edge toward closing. And first, I just put out my very enthusiastic vote for any more future conversations we can book. Count me in, because I'm just so enjoying all the various pieces that you've put together to be who you are and doing what you're doing. And if you don't mind, I'd like to loop us back to earlier in the conversation. We're talking about more at the most basic level of people coming together in very small numbers, in the most local of arrangements. And a couple of things that you express a lot of gratitude for in your writing on Medium and so on. You talk about the immense value that you've gotten out of being in circle, being with people intentionally in a crafted environment, in a held environment, and bearing witness to one another in a good way. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more of that, because that's certainly where my body of work is going, is to offer people as many of the most basic tools of self-awareness, and then shared self-awareness that becomes more or less a group dynamic awareness. Some of those elements that you have seen more often than not when it's really working, and maybe even share a little bit about what's it like when it's really working, when you're in a group and it's just humming.
Well, that's I mean, that's the reason why we called our company the Hum, right? Like,
Okay,
like,
good.
what is it like when the group's really humming? And you've put me in a paradox here, because you said we're closing this conversation, and then you just opened like the biggest topic in the world. So, some thoughts on that. I mean, one is, I think the tradition of circle is passed hand to hand and face to face. That it's a torch, and I don't know what I did to qualify to have been in circles hosted by people that are connected to a very long tradition. But I have had just such extraordinary benefit in my life because of those experiences. And now I'm like getting to the age where I'm starting to go like, oh, is it my turn? Do I have to hold the circle? Oh my God. So again, that's kind of like a point reinforcing what I said earlier of like, find the people who already know what they're doing and sit at their feet. The experience, there's so many different ones that I've had. One of them is saying, it's the circle is where I get to say unspeakable things. And there are so many like constrictions and constraints on what we're allowed to say and what we allow ourselves to say in any situation. And the circle is the space where I've had those constraints removed in a really supportive and healthy way. So like when I was having my doubts about some of the themes in feminism, it was the circle that I could inquire into those, knowing that it was okay that I was going to say some dumb stuff and get it wrong, and that eventually it would come back around and people would help me see where I had pointed out something new and valuable, and where I had kind of missed the point or misrepresented myself or whatever. And I needed to be in a space that was super safe to be able to risk saying something that makes me look like a misogynist, you know. It's also the experience of collective intelligence, of being one neuron in a collective brain and not having to take responsibility for the whole, but just for the part that's called me, you know, like just, I'm going to be me. I'm going to spend 90% of the time listening. And if I feel that surge of energy come up through my body and out my vocal cords, well, then I'll share what I've got to say. But I'm not going to take responsibility for coherence or unity or consensus. I'm just going to do the part that I am called to do, and trust that the meaning will emerge from the spaces between us. And I know that's really abstract if you haven't done it, you know. But there's been a number of times where I've just seen the collective wisdom that just far exceeds any individual I've ever met.
Yeah.
And somehow has this abundance of insight and compassion and joy and creativity. Just like, whoa, it's like everything we need is here, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
That's certainly my experience, and I know that you have rafts more that you could share. Obviously, with the just with the Hum name alone, you could dive in, and I'd be happy to dive in with you. But one thing I'd like to just acknowledge you for that conveyed really well in the few articles I got to read before our talk is there's a transparency and a vulnerability that you share very generously when you're talking about the benefits of being in that kind of held environment, that kind of conscious shared environment. And you were, I think, pointing in that direction in what you just said. But there's something about the combination of how transparently you share yourself in those articles, and there's just a sweetness in that kind of self-deprecation or just vulnerability, just being humble and letting the truth that I think you were just describing it as a, wave that might come up and show itself. I might call it the truth of the moment, that you can hold that. You seem to hold that really well. The power that is the truth of the moment that is invited, and to be able to somehow also hold humility. Does that spark you to say anything?
It does, which is, don't mistake the sculpture for the artist. That while I am trying to model transparency and humility and vulnerability and so on, like, what takes you 20 minutes to read took me 100 hours to write. It's not me, it's not me. And yeah, don't be confused. Just because I'm speaking from the first person doesn't mean it's me. It's this crafted artifact of hundreds of conversations and a lot of personal work and refinement and polishing, and like really, I mean, I've been writing intentionally in public for coming up 20 years. So it's a very carefully structured performance,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to perform as close as possible to something that looks like reality, but it's gone through a lot of, it's kind of a funny, like a performed authenticity or something, like it's quite a weird dynamic. And I only feel like I'm really me, like I said, in the circle. That's where I feel like I'm most, that's where I'm transparent. That's where I actually turn to glass and you actually see what my guts look like.
Yeah. And just so you know, that conveyed really well just now, and it was nearly identical to what you said in a number of those articles. And I still stand strong in my acknowledgement. I just appreciate your pointing out some of these kind of gold nuggets that it would be good for myself and the folks who may partake in this body of work that's formulating, to keep their eyes open for these gold nuggets, these pieces that more often than not tend to show up when things are humming. And so yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. It just seems like whatever you're up to with the various organizations that you're part of or have created, there's a tremendous amount of value at a number of different levels. The organizations you get to work with, the individuals you work with, and then the value that you will create for each other within it. Again, I'm just really looking forward to whenever we get a chance to deepen any one of the threads that we've talked about or others. And I'm wondering if I could just ask of you one thing. If this was our last chance to have a conversation like this, and if there was a way for me to get this out to a huge audience, talking to the general public, but at least to an audience that is just trying their best to look into the world that we've got going on. And this particular audience, we at least know that they would like to do something. They would like to know where to put their attention, what's possible in this world. If you had a minute or two with that scope of a far larger audience that was ready to hear you, what would you say?
It's an unfamiliar position for me to be in, because I'm used to speaking with a small group, and the larger the group, the more what I have to offer, it feels like it dissolves into platitudes. I believe in communication as an exchange, and I don't know much about a mass group. I mean, my instinct is just, it's the really basic stuff. It's not reaching forward into some unknown future of this bold solution or that amazing piece of technology or this revolution or something, but just the really basic stuff of hospitality and care and neighborliness and looking after the people in your house, and if you've got anything left over, look after the people in the house next door. And my guiding heuristics has been to if we are heading towards some really desperate collapse, or whatever the word is, like if our future is extremely uncertain, the heuristics I've used to guide me are number one, learn how to work together. Mm-hmm. And number two, in all of my action, contribute to the common good, like meet my needs and leave some kind of positive residue out there that is of benefit to someone else. Those have been the two lights that guide me. I don't know if they're valuable to other people. But yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to have to meditate on it a bit more because it's unfamiliar.
Well, I'm sorry for whatever discomfort that might have brought on, and I couldn't have asked for a more beautiful response. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the acknowledgement.
Yeah. Richard Bartlett, an absolute pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for the work that you do on every level. And as I've said way too many times already, I look forward to our...
Amen.
I hope for as many more conversations. And who knows, maybe I can connect up with you next time to be able to find out more about, I don't know if it's visiting down in New Zealand or what, but particularly with Inspiral, and perhaps it's the Hum now. I don't know, but I'd love to find a way to sit with y'all in circle from time to time, or for a couple of times. And
so to find me and to follow my links out to all the different endeavors, richdecibels.com.
Okay. Well, I will put those links in the show notes. And great conversation. Thank you so much.
A great pleasure. Let's book another one in a little while and see what new stuff has come up in the interim.
With pleasure. Take good care of yourself.
I will do it. Good to meet you, Dean.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.